resources and estimation of reserves. This is a listing of the technical papers that are in that monograph. So just a quick flick through, you can see there's a range of subjects being covered. And the idea is really to, again, not to give everybody a recipe book for how you do everything, but to give some very good learning experiences from good, well-recognized practitioners, so that it adds to the wealth of knowledge that the competent, qualified person can take into account. So that's the papers on resource estimation. That's the papers on reserve estimation. When I was preparing these slides, one thing that I noticed was that there's 9 papers under resources, 7 under reserves. There's a lot more words in the ones on resources. And I have to say, speaking as a geologist as well, that confirms what I've always known. Geologists use far more words than do engineers. I don't say whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, it's just a fact, I think. So the other activities that are undertaken or practiced around the world is really the encouragement in all countries for competent persons to become proficient in their profession and in the skills they're seeking to acquire. In Canada, the CIM is working right now on best practice guidelines for a pre-feasibility study and a feasibility study. I believe the drafts will be available at the end of this year. That could be of particular interest, I think, here, because the conversion from resource to reserve has to go through a study under CRISCO standards that is at least at a pre-feasibility study level. So the more guidance that is available, I think, the better for this group. In Russia, the geology and mining practices integrated into the state expertise. I'm reading this verbatim because I didn't compile it. Methodological documents for various types of minerals, which guide the estimation of Russian mineral deposits. And some countries do that. China's similar, I understand. You know, there is some specific guidance in the country's own system that provides guidance, sometimes almost dictates what you should do in certain situations to estimate the resources and reserves and to explore. And in the USA, the Society of Mining Engineers is in the process of preparing a best practice manual as well. This is my wrap-up slide for this one. What I'm suggesting is that if it's agreed that there should be a subcommittee, a small committee or a group appointed by this by the ISA out of this workshop, that the second part of its mandate should be the preparation of best practice guidelines. Now, I think that's not something that's going to be done quickly. It needs a lot of discussion and need the input from experts in several different fields. So I'm hoping that as the discussions go in the next couple of days, that'll come a bit clearer as to the, how that could be brought about. But I think extending the CRISCO reporting template in the way that was described in my first talk, combined with the best practice guidelines for the input of everybody who has relevant expertise here, I think would provide the ISA with what it needs to go forward with seabed mining, both in the Clarion Clipperton and other areas as well. Thank you.
Do we have any questions? I'm sure some will come up and continue our other.
Thank you. I wanted to ask was having a question for Mr. Mathur. You say competent person who has got the sea, who has seen the sea and worked on the and all these things, we will be able to correct the thing and give the results, because nobody will retain that the best complaint persons who have the experience of the sea going to the sea and work in the mountain area or the sunrise area or coast area. That may be considered, because otherwise he will not be able to appreciate the work done by the conductors. Thank you.
Subcommittee, competent person, very comprehensive presentation on CP. I just wanted to share something about Indian practice. Let's say land-based projects in India, and particularly the government-managed projects. The basis for project approvals and project funding and all the upstream activities, starting from exploration, estimation, mine planning, mine design, so cost estimates, everything. All that is done by an experienced engineering consulting company. That's the basis for project approvals and project financing. Even the financial institutes use that kind of document for assessing the financial viability. When it comes to the approval of the mine plan, there we have a system of RQP, registered qualified person. He approves the mine plan, and that's true for whether it is government managed projects or private sector projects. So, for instance, let's imagine that we are maturing to a nodule project tomorrow, and we need to go for the project approval, project financing in a government sort of managed projects. I assume that the procedure that the government would follow will be, again, what has been done till now, is to again go through a competent engineering company to produce the relevant documents for approval as well as for financing. I understand that when it is run by the private companies, where you need to address the shareholders in the government setup, the government is the shareholder, so it manages everything within itself. I understand the role, which is very critical when it comes to private sector, when you have to address the financiers, you have to address the shareholders. But in a setup managed by the government, we follow entirely a different system. I just thought I'll share this point. Thank you.
I think that's a very good point to make. Yeah, and I emphasize again that everything I've discussed, and I think what Matthew discussed before, was in relation to the market-related reporting. That's quite right. But they can, and they do, exist side by side with government sort of requirements as well. So, yeah.
Thank you, Pat. I'm speaking as an incompetent person. I'm pretty sure, Matt, I would never satisfy the criteria getting into the Australian Institute of Geology maybe 40 years ago. Pat, you made us a recommendation in red at the end of your first talk, and I see you link to another recommendation here which speaks to a small group. And I thought I heard you at least once or twice, and maybe someone else, refer to the fact that modifying this as a possible approach for the Seabed Authority in regard to deep sea minerals, you didn't consider that a particularly difficult or time-consuming task. And I'm wondering whether it would be possible to do it whilst we're here, so you can share it with the group, so that we can take away from here a sentiment as to, a feeling of support for it, and particularly whilst we have contractors here. So I just feel that in terms of moving forward, if it is possible for a small group to look, as you suggest, I think, quite quickly but thoroughly at how this could be modified. I think I, for one, would be quite interested to see that document during the workshop and maybe encourage a sentiment from the workshop as a whole as to whether there's a general support for it. It's just taking that step beyond. It's a good idea, let's do it somehow by somebody after the workshop. If you suggest that it is a fairly easy task to do, could it not be done once we're here? And let's all have a look at it. Please?
Yeah, you've really taken advantage of the way I described it, haven't you? That's fair enough. I should never say something's easy. But look, I think that's a fair point, and I have already discussed that with me as well. I think that is possible. Matthew's nodding, so I'm hoping Matthew would be part of that group, because I think that identifying the areas that would require a bit of tweaking shouldn't take too long. Actually drafting, if you like, the additional clauses that should cover SIB and nodules, the exact drafting of those, I think might take a bit longer, but I think we could identify the subjects that should be or the topics that should be the subjects of those clauses, whether we could arrive at a recommended wording for each one of those, I don't know, but it's amazing what can be done over several beers tonight. I think that's entirely possible. Good suggestion.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for that. Good talk. I guess coffee break is now, so I suggest we go ahead and do that. Could we come back in 20 minutes, save 10 minutes to pass on? So we'll be back in the room at 3:20 to begin the next talk. Thank you very much.
Yeah, it seems like we're tag team with Pat, so that's right, Pat. The question of identifying aspects of polymetallic nodules that are different and that require being addressed in the code was a rather difficult process for me. I pondered over it quite a long time, even actually I was still thinking about it while I was having a swim when I got here on Saturday. And at the end of the day, I see, yes, there are differences, but are those differences significant enough to warrant big changes or significant changes to all new code? The answer, in my opinion, is no. I don't think the differences are sufficient. I think the current code, the Crisco code or the NI 43101 is sufficient for purposes. And the reason is because we've actually done it. We've applied the NI 43101 code and we've got it through the regulators. It was a painful process, but we managed to do that. And so I think that the code as it is more than adequate, although probably, as Pat alluded to, maybe some little tweaks here and there, mainly just more from a wording perspective. And I'll go through that because Pat talked about table 1, and so I thought, well, the best way to describe the differences is basically to go through table 1 and lay it out and present which are what I consider different and which I would consider the same. And so this presentation is going to be fairly short because there's not a lot to actually say, as I think that the differences aren't significant. So the first point, sampling, and this is part of the table 1. And the first method, obviously the method is a bit different. Sampling, we understand that you're not drilling and you're not obtaining individual samples where you then got to interpret and produce a volume. You actually get all that in your sample. You get basically the volume and density in your sample, the abundance. So the method is different, but is it different enough to warrant any changes to the code? I don't think so. I think actually it should be on the other side, the similarities, because in the code you describe the method. It doesn't matter how you sample it, you just describe it. And so you still have to do that, and so there's no difference there. In this case, the table 1 describes drilling. We don't use drilling. So I think
maybe there needs maybe a little bit of wording change to that. Instead of drilling, we just mention that there's physical sampling through box cores and so on. So just a little bit of wording changes on that. Description of the method, as I mentioned, goes on the similarities, because we have to actually describe the method. Description of subsampling. QA/QC, we need that for everything, every deposit we do an estimate for, we need QA/QC, as I mentioned in my previous talk. It is a critical component that should not be overlooked. And if you're not collecting it, start collecting it. Verification of the sampling, that's the same, regardless of the deposit type. Logging. Logging might be a little bit different. You might actually be logging the shape, size, and description of the nodule as opposed to topology, alteration, and mineralisation, and so on. But again, you just describe what you're logging. So there's no real difference. Recovery method, or the amount of recovery, how many nodules you've recovered in your sampling method. I haven't seen any information describing what that is. You can sort of get an idea of what it might be through Monte Carlo simulations, but the sample recovery would be different. So the free-fall grabs to the box core, your recovery of the sample is going to be different. The amount of nodules that you lose. And so you still need to describe or discuss what you're losing. The location of samples, same. We need to measure the location of the samples as accurate as we can. Data spacing, again, it's the same. We just basically describe that we've got, say for instance, 20 kilometre spaced samples. Now the regulator might get really worried about that spacing, but when you put it into context of the size of the deposit, it's not. It's not as big an issue. But you just describe what the spacing is. Orientation of data, it's not relevant to this, so that's a difference. The data archives, how the data is stored, whether it's stored in the database, how it's secured, that's all the same. It's irrespective of the deposit type, doesn't matter. So, as you can see, there's a lot more on the similarities than there is on the dissimilarities, and the differences, they're just minor changes, mainly to what is described in the table. Just a brief description on volume. You know, the typical deposit, we do samples where we collect it, and we then got to do an interpretation to define volume. And then with the volume, we have to get samples to obtain density, and then that gives us our tonnage. In the case of the nodules, we get both of that in our nodule abundance. So we don't actually have to worry about our interpretation of volume. It comes explicit with the sampling. So there is a little bit of a difference there, but does it actually make it significantly different that we have to warrant a change to the code? No. You just describe the method. As I said, it just removes the risk of interpretation. But there are other risks to interpretation, not just volume. The other big difference, nodules can be mapped pretty much 100%. The surface, you can see them. You know that they're there, and you can use remote sensing techniques like video or multi-beam to map it. Obviously at different quality resolutions than you would actually get from box core sampling, but still valuable. So you can sample your nodules, take your video. Oops. And in between the sample locations that you might get box core, you might take some video of the same locations. It's what happens in between, the continuity in between. And that's the same, irrespective of the deposit, we always have to worry about what's between our sample points. In the case of the nodules, we can actually define 100% what's going on between those sample points using the video or the multi-beam. The question is, though, whether that sampling is regarded as physical samples, because we're taking a representation of nodule percent coverage, and then we have to express that in terms of nodule abundance. So, yeah, nodule percent coverage, we can use multi-beam or side-scan sonar or video, or even some other newfangled technique we haven't yet developed. Add that with your box cores and get some sort of estimate of nodule abundance. And so we could probably use that to infill our box core samples. So this is our grid, like 20 kilometre spacing, for instance, and infill those with abundance taken from video. The question is, though, how can we utilise that information in resource estimation when it's not true physical sampling? My feeling is possibly it can be used. We've had discussions with Tommel over this, and we've considered the issue quite closely, and I think it could be used as long as there are controls in place, because it's open to fraud, if I'd like to say. You could easily manipulate the data without anyone actually knowing about it. So the controls in place, I would suggest maybe, again, come back to the competent person. Having an independent, competent person present on the boat as you're doing the sampling to check off to make sure that you're doing it correctly will overcome that and allow you to do that. So I'd recommend, like for the ISA, to say, well, if you're going to use this as a recommendation, suggest having an independent competent person. So if you're going to do this, we would like to see an independent competent person present on the boat as a control measurement, and then that way you get away with using it. So the idea is basically, I've also done a simulation exercise, or my colleague at Golder had done a simulation exercise with my guidance to identify and understand the level of spacing required to get to indicated, because that's the next step, and that's the role of a competent person as well as to help guide them to the next point. You know, what do we have to do to get to indicated? And so we did some simulations to figure out what that spacing is, and basically, yeah, it comes down to a point that, okay, if we're continuing to increase our confidence, if the requirement is so high that cost of sampling can also get quite high because of the requirement. So the utilisation of techniques where you can use video or multi-beam to derive abundance will help reduce that confidence and increase the chances of getting to indicated. Because otherwise you may need significant amounts of sampling, and in which case it might be too costly. Scale, both in the vertical and the horizontal, it's absolutely massive. In terms of relationship with other terrestrial paste deposits, there is no scale that we can compare with. The closest we come to would probably be the iron ore and the nickel laterites, but you're dealing with at least a factor of 10, maybe 20 times larger than nodule deposit. And in this case, this is what has allowed us to progress through and get the resource estimate through the regulators by utilising the fact of scale. Because by utilising the scale, the dimensions of the deposit, we're able to put in perspective the scale of the sampling. You know, the regulators were very, very nervous about using 20 kilometre spacing. You could hear them just literally falling off the chair with so much angst and worry. And in the end, we actually managed to convince them that yes, it's adequate. But it took some time to get them comfortable with the scale. And it's all about scale. It's not just in the sampling, it's also regards mining, it's also regarding the environmental. It's getting this perception of scale across to the stakeholders. Exploration results, another segment of the table 1. Break it down exactly the same way. Mineral rights, it's no difference. History, we've still got to describe that. We did that in the technical report. It's a good way of acknowledging the past, acknowledging the previous pioneers, and giving credit where credit's due. Describing the geology, it's no difference. Even though the deposit's different, we still describe the geology. In fact, I'll go to a point where the nodule deposits, yes, they're unique, but so is Telfer. Telfer, the gold deposit, there's only one Telfer. There's only one Olympic dam. There's only one Witwatersrand got to pronounce them right. And yet, what they have in common is the code that they report under. So all three of those deposits, they're the unique ones. There's nothing like it in the world. There's only one. People have been looking, because I used to work at Telfa, they've been looking for 20 years and still never found one. But it doesn't mean that they should have their own code because they're unique. It's the same with nodules. Yes, they're unique, but they still fit under the code. And the code is what I'm meaning is the Chris code template and all of the variants. Exploration results in the table. There's a description that you've got to give relationships between mineralisation widths and intercepts. Again, it's not relevant to nodules. So whether you actually reword that or remove that section, but it's not relevant to nodules. Diagrams, yeah, you've got to include diagrams in the report. And it's actually a must. So the lawyers will go through your technical report and go, have you got diagrams? Yes, no. And are those labelled properly? And have they got the north arrow and so on? And they can be very pedantic about it. Balanced reporting, no difference there. We've actually got to state the good and the bad. Other exploration data, yeah, we might rely on video or multi-beam. We just describe it. So again, the code can handle it. And further work. That's where the competent person will come in and say, okay, we're at inferred. This is what we need to do to get to indicated. And that is a guidance to the contractor to know exactly what they need to do, what work they need to do, what sampling, spacing, and so on. If there are issues with the code, trying to get it to fit with indicated, what needs to be done, what needs to be captured. So the competent person helps you work that out. Obviously, that's controlled by how much you're actually willing to and able to spend as well. So you can only sample so much in such a short period of time. Resource estimation. Again, I'll take the same approach, differences and similarities. Again, on the similarity side, we'll go database integrity. We have to describe that. There's no way we can get around it, and there's no difference between any type of deposit. It doesn't matter what deposit, we have to describe it. The geological interpretation. I've thrown it on this side because generally, regardless of the deposit, you always interpret the domains. You interpret how you're going to estimate it. But in the case of the nodules, we took an approach where the whole area was one domain, so there was no interpretation. But that was an inferred. Inferred allows you to get away with that to some degree because it's a rubbery category, whereas going to indicated, you have to go more into the subdomains and do a little bit more interpretation if you've got that information available, and if it is material to the estimate. Because at some domains might only account for only 1 or 2% of the total area, and in case of an inferred resource, it's not material. In the case of a measured resource, it may start to become material because it will affect your reserves and how you mine around it. So you've just got to factor that in. Each category determines essentially how you grade materiality. Dimensions, you just describe it, so there's no difference. The estimation method, we can use industry standard methods that are applied and that the industry is expecting you to apply, and the most common technique is called ordinary kriging, which is just a geostatistical method that is basically a best linear unbiased estimator, and that's what the industry expects. But in the case of the nodules, the estimation method for grade, I have no issue. I could actually classify that as indicated, but I have an issue with abundance. And I've been always telling John that I've always had an issue with abundance. And it's getting around that issue of abundance, because grade is not an issue, abundance is. So how do we address abundance? And how can we address that in the estimation method? Modelling method, I'll put it on the differences side because it is a little bit different, although it isn't. In fact, it can actually go back to the side on the similarities. So at the end of the day, in the technical report or in just a report based on the JORC Table 1, we just describe our modelling methodology. So it doesn't matter how we do it, we just describe it. So there's no difference between the various different deposits of how we model it. We just have to be open and transparent about it and present that information. Okay? In this case, the modelling method is basically two-dimensional. We don't do the typical interpretation of volume that you do for terrestrial-based deposits. We don't have to worry more about density because densities come into the factoring of collecting the nodule abundance. But in that case, we actually need to understand moisture content and how that, excuse me, the weight of abundance is measured, so quality control. And the other aspect, the difference is probably in the modelling aspect, is the fact that we didn't really apply domains because we considered the whole thing as one domain. Although some would argue, okay, there are all these different nodule facies, and everyone might have their own opinion about what nodule facies is, but in the case of resource estimation, if it's all the same grade, I don't care. It's all one domain. As I mentioned, moisture, so we do need to describe moisture. It's one of those bits of information that is a little bit lacking and it's hard to find. And so if you're gathering it, be cognizant of the fact that you do actually have to describe the moisture content. Bulk density, I put it on the side of the differences, principally because it's implicit in the nodule abundance. You're not actually measuring density strictly, you're weighing nodules and you're getting density with it to some degree. Cut-off parameters, I threw it on this side because basically I see cut-off parameters as different to typical terrestrial-based deposits in the sense that normally when you do a resource estimate for terrestrial-based deposits, you apply a cut-off being what you describe as being waste from ore. In the case of nodules here, nodules are everywhere. All that matters is the frequency of the nodules changes, and it changes quite rapidly. So describe domaining in the sense of a cut-off based on that is nonsensical in a sense, because it also comes back to how you're going to mine it. You might start off at the high abundance zones and you slowly work your way down to the lower abundance zones. And the cut-off in the sense of the typical mining approach sort of disappears. It's not the same. You're not working in the fact that you're following an area because this has got 6 kilograms per square metre, whereas another one's got 6.5. Mining and metallurgy factors. Again, you just describe that, so there's nothing different there. Classification, we still apply the same classification scheme, so we still have to factor in risks, modifying factors, and the geology, continuity, uncertainty, and the accuracy of the estimate. So there's still a lot more on the similarity side as there are on the differences, and those that are on the differences, we can actually it can be handled by the code. So in that sense, there's really no real differences. Domaining, you've got geological domaining, that's the facies or any other interesting features that you might be interested in that you're from a scientific perspective. And then you've got the grade and statistical domains which you use in resource estimation. They can be similar, in most cases they're different. You've also got metallurgical domains. And this could be a factor of grade. So in some areas you might have a higher cobalt and in other areas a lower cobalt. That may affect metallurgical recoveries, for instance. It may not, but I'm just saying fine. Or you might have another area that, in the case of terrestrial-based deposits, you might have arsenic or some other deleterious element and you don't like, so you've got to domain those out from a metallurgical perspective. In the case of nodules, it's probably not as critical. Environmental domains. They're mainly just basically areas that are exclusion zones, as we've described, Pat and myself mentioned previously. So they're areas environmental, you've got a buffer zone, you just domain that out. You don't actually even produce a resource estimate in there, because as soon as you put a number in there, somebody's likely to report it. I always actually exclude it from the resource estimate completely. Don't put a number. Your license area, this might sound rather basic, but it can be missed. When you produce a resource estimate, you limit it to within your license area. So it becomes a domain, essentially. I mentioned exclusion zones. But the exclusion zones could be other things as well, like social. For instance, you might have a shipping lane go through an area, in which case you might consider that excuse me, a no-go zone for a while. until you've actually negotiated with the people who use that to access that area. So it's not necessarily a complete exclusion of the resource, but you might exclude it on that basis that you haven't actually got access to it yet. In terms of domaining, I just thought I'd throw up a nice little picture to try and explain what I'm meaning by it. Now, we might have, what I've got here, maybe 4 different domains. We've got a couple of little ones. Let's just say they're different fascies. Multiple geological domains, but 1 grade domain. From a resource estimation point of view, we're interested in more the grade domain as opposed to the geological. Although we can still build it into the model, it doesn't really factor into the estimate. And then you've got your license boundary, exclusion zone. So, they become your domains. As I said at the beginning, there are differences between the terrestrial deposits and the nodules, but I don't think those differences are significant enough to warrant any real major change to the code. As I said, we've done it before, so there's no reason why anyone else can't. They can actually follow on from what we've done, and in fact, through the TOML, we paved the way essentially through the Canadian system. We've actually managed to some degree, get them to accept and be comfortable with the aspects of nodules. And so, second or third estimate going through them, they'll be more comfortable with it and go, oh, okay, now we're starting to see a pattern here. Because one of the questions from the regulator was, okay, using your modelling method, how do we know that's industry best practice in relation to the nodules? Well, it's chicken egg, it's the first one, so we don't have a best practice. So we had to argue with them on that point, and then, okay. But the second one, they come through and go, okay, well, we'll do it the same way or similar. So thank you. There it is.
I'm sure we got some questions. Matthew?
Just 2 comments. In terms of density, it is true that you don't need to do the density measurement for computations of volumes or the tonnage, but you do need to measure density and bulk density for downstream activities like computation of storage areas, for instance, or when you are studying the slurry transport, you need the numerical value of the density. So that's
I agree. I think, even as I was going from the point of view of estimation, it's sort of factored into the domain, into the nodule abundance. But as you say, knowledge of the density, moisture is still important factors from downstream processing and materials movement and handling. Yes, agree.
Second point, in terms of bathymetry, for the terrestrial deposit, you don't need the bathymetric information. You need that. You need topographic information for volumetric computations. For nodule, you don't need that for volumetric computation. But what you need is to determine if the nodule becomes a future eventual potential reserve. Mm-hmm. For instance, the nodules lying on the, let's say, seamounts or on the steeper slope areas, which may not be possible for the mining system to negotiate. Therefore, those are the areas which will become restrictive resource, perhaps not accessible for the first generation mining technology, maybe for the next 50 years maybe. So I think mathematical information is important to identify such resources.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, from an inferred perspective, the size of the sampling and the size of the block, it's not material. But when you go forward into indicated, if, dare I say, you actually ever get to measure, which you probably don't think you would, but to get to indicated, yes, you start to add those sort of subdomains into it. Yeah, agreed that bathymetric or gradients, where you know that you may not mine it now with current technology, but later on you might, then you don't necessarily exclude it, but you actually report it separately. You know, so you just identify 2 different areas, and those 2 different areas, A and B. A is on the low slope areas, which we know we can get to. B are on the high slope areas where we know possibly we can get to later, or maybe not.
That's the kind of information the ESA, I think, is looking for mineable areas. When you identify minor areas, you need to identify this separately.
Yes. You know, actually, I wanted to ask earlier, in the presentation at the time it was stopped. In fact, I think this other gentleman come on the stage. I think I will ask on the earlier presentation as well as on this present one. Actually, in the earlier presentation, as you said, I think it's only an industry. Actually, industry expert only is expected to be a CP than an academician. Actually, I have another, I think, an opinion on this, in the sense, we have an industry actually expert who has gone into sea and he has not seen a nodule, example. And I have an academician actually who had been always into the sea and he has been doing exploration. Actually, why are you actually bringing it only an industrial expert as an expert only, and why not an academician as an expert into this domain of CP? That I will ask, and then in this presentation, also in fact I have got something to ask. I think if you can answer this and then.
Yeah, I think in that sense that, as I said, when I first did the resource reporting with TOML, we utilised other experts, and the experts in the exploration, like Charles and David. So, from a CP's perspective, you're not always, when you do the first estimate, you're not always going to have every aspect covered. And so, you need other experts or other, maybe not necessarily competent people, but other experts that you can rely on, and you can utilise that information and that reliance as you work through the estimate. And then you can also help those experts maybe become competent people if they qualify.
No, actually, again, I have to have a clarification. Is an expert is a CP or CP is an expert? You try to bring a clarity to me on this point. In fact, I understand from your side and all, an expert is there, but that expert is not a CP. His expertise will be utilized, you are saying. And on the other side, you are saying, actually, we have a CP actually who has no expertise, except that actually he has been given a status of a CP as he belongs to an industry, and he doesn't belong to, I think, an exploration. So at the end of the day, do you mean to say, I think an exploration geologist, actually, who is an academician, actually, he can be identified as CP or not?
Yeah, as I said, following the code, there's a strict definition of what a CP actually is. And so if the expert has those requirements, then they are a CP. But if they don't have those requirements, then they are still an expert, but they can't sign off in regard to the code because they're not a CP. So, yep.
Can I also add to that? Just to support what Matthew's saying, that's exactly the case. And I think it's important to recognise that the reason for the competent person concept or the qualified person concept is that under the CRUSCO system, we are reporting to the public. We are reporting to investors and potential investors who hopefully will lend money. In order for, and we have a system where the professional, the expert, has to make a lot of judgment calls and take responsibility. Now, for that to work effectively, there needs to be a way in which that expert can be brought to account or can be disciplined if they do something that's not acceptable. And so the competent persons must belong to organisations that have the ability to discipline and have agreed that they will. So, in theory, the experts you're talking about could be competent persons if the organisation that they're a member of agrees that they will discipline that person if they don't comply with the appropriate standards. So it's not, I think you have to be very careful that the word competent person is probably not a good one, because it almost implies that somebody who isn't a competent person must be
Incompetent.
Somebody is incompetent, in other words.
So it's, I think we have to be very careful that, and you'll usually see in a technical report a table of the qualified persons who take responsibility, and then often a list of experts who have assisted them. And some of those experts may only be experts because they're not a member of a professional body that has part of the CRISPR system. That's the only reason.
Okay. I think as an extension of it, I would like to ask another question. Actually, as a, I think in a hypothetical situation, or even in case of India, actually India is a, representing a, sovereign state. Actually, do you require again to have a CP for a sovereign state as well? I can have a number of them, isn't it? In a hypothetical situation, or not?
Yeah, as Pat said, if you're reporting internally, you don't need it. But if you're generating resource estimates and you know that you're going to want to have the industry participate in, you say, okay, here's a resource estimate, and trying to get an industry player on board to take that, then it's also very useful to have that estimate done to a particular code, so that when that company comes along, they go, oh, okay, we've got the estimate, we can actually take that as value. Okay, so otherwise, if you just give them a resource estimate that's not the code, then they're going to have to turn around and do it themselves, and then try and assess it and evaluate it. But if they get it already in that state, then it's added value, if you will.
Okay.
So you don't necessarily have to, but in some instances it might be a good idea.
Yeah, I have already done with your earlier presentation. I have got another question on this presentation. I understand, from your presentation, I think abundance is an issue. Okay, abundance is an issue, and also it is addressed by you. It can be a fraud. Okay, suppose it is a fraud, created by I think an individual or a group of individuals or a contractor has reported a fraud data. I would like to ask you, as a CP, how will you resolve these abundance estimates?
Yeah, it comes down to the point that if the CP is not involved with the sampling, and the CP is not comfortable with that sampling, the CP doesn't use it. So, for instance, if you've got box cores and then you've infilled with video, and they say, okay, here's the video of the CP. If I was the CP, I'd say, no, I can't use that video because I wasn't involved, I didn't see it happening, so I'm not confident on it. I don't have the trust in it. But if there are other controls in place that might be instrumental, that some way of physically recording into the video where it can't be tampered with, then that could be sufficient to utilise it. So that when I say, putting controls in place around it to prevent the likelihood of that occurring, so you actually increase the confidence that the CP will say, yes, I can use that. Doesn't necessarily mean that fraudulent behaviour will occur, it just means that it's possible. And if it's possible, then as a CP, we've got to question it. Irrespective of what the sampling is, if we suspect that there might be ways of tampering with it, then we've got to state it as, this sampling is not secure, there's potential tampering that could occur in it, and take that as a risk. We can still utilise it, but we still report it as a risk, and it's up to them, the third party, to make that decision. But if we suspect that there is potential fraudulent activity, then we've also got to make sure we state that as well. It's the role of the CP, because it's our responsibility for the estimate. And if there is fraudulent activity and it gets found out, then the CP is responsible for it. That's where it comes to. And so the CP has to be very careful about that and take that seriously about the quality of the data and how it's collected, why it's collected, where it's collected, and so on. It's a really important aspect of it. And sometimes it involves the CP observing that behaviour to make sure, and we do it all the time, we go to site visits as well and observe the sampling, the RC drilling, the diamond drilling, and observe every process to make sure that they actually are doing the right thing, that there is no sample bias, there is no issues with the way they're sampling or how they're logging or any other aspect to it. It's part of the role of the CP to do that, and it's a very important role, and the CP needs to take that as very seriously, because it is one aspect of the NI 43-101 code. It's the reason why the CP came into being, because there was a lot of fraudulent activity in the mining industry, and it caused a lot of issues. And so the regulator said, enough is enough, we've got to put controls on. And so the controls came into being.
You know, actually, I think at this point I would like to add here, I also heard you saying a CP is a god. I think, I think in empowering a CP as a god, I think in this kind of an exploration where there is an uncertainty, there is a huge uncertainty on the ground itself. And you have got nodules here, you don't have immediately after actually half a kilometer, you don't have any nodules at all. Or there are nodules, it is, fully under the, sediment cover, and you cannot resolve them. I can show you, they have arrived in the grab, but I cannot show you, actually I have an image of that place, it doesn't show nodules. At the end of the day, I have got from that location nodules. Actually, how, at the end of the day, God will resolve this. This God, he cannot be, I think, empowered at the end of the day as a God to dictate the terms actually to an explorationist or an exploration campaign. At the end of the day, I'm sure, I think if anybody is into an exploration game, I think, he wants to be honest. It's not that he wants to be actually dishonest to ISA. And so, actually, I'm afraid, of course, at the end of, all this talk, I also understand all these LTC members are not CPs, they are IPs, in fact. Okay, that's what I'm understanding from all this deliberation. But I think, we are trying to define something. I think it will go in entirely in a different scope of a domain, because we are handling an uncertain deposit that required to be proved over time and again, and also intensity of exploration.
Perhaps I could add there. Again, everything that Matthew and I have been describing is to do with market-related reporting. So it's all to do with when we're at the reporting stage where we're reporting publicly with the aim of raising money from investors. When you're at that stage, there is huge potential for money to be won and lost in the stock market, because and this has happened, and this is exactly what Matthew's alluding to. There has been fraudulent activity. I mean, 99% of industry professionals are completely honest people. Unfortunately, there's 1% who aren't. Those 1% require us to set in place rules and standards to protect the public, so that when a company goes to the public, to the stock market, looking to raise money, there are protections in place. And under the competent person, qualified person, there is a person who has taken personal responsibility for the reliability of that information. And as Matthew was saying, this is a serious responsibility. They can, in the extreme situation, they can go to jail, and that has happened. In other situations, they can lose their right to practice. So it's not questioning the honesty or the reliability of the people who do the work, if you like, prior to the stage at which we're reporting to the public. It's all about, when we're ready to report to the public, how do we protect the public from potential fraudulent activity, like 0.5% of the professionals who might do that. And the one I alluded to, Brex or Busang, people lost hundreds of millions of dollars in that share market scheme. And they can make hundreds of millions of dollars. And the stock markets that control, if you like, access to the funds here, they have their own rules to ensure that the market is protected. And so they require that the rules that we set up as part of the public reports also have those protections in place. That's the difference that we're talking about.
This is great. So I just thought I'd add a couple of comments because when the mineral resource was worked out for Tomo, Nautilus had to make some decisions because we actually had to choose Golda and decide they could be the competent person. So I guess the first point I want to make is that we integrate a lot of things into our thinking in the way we do things. So, for example, environment, social responsibility is integrated in everything that we do from the outset. And another thing that's integrated in what we do from the outset is industry best practice. Now, when we come to industry best practice, it's not just about what the stock market wants. That's always in our minds. That was in our minds when we approached Golda, because we have an established relationship with Golda from Solwara 1. And we'd already been through a path trying to convince the world this could be mine. However, 5 minutes after Golda agreed to do this technical report for us, because we didn't know we were going to get a mineral resource when we started this process, we just needed a technical report that may or may not have a mineral resource. We immediately contacted the second CP, and we chose that person very carefully, just the way we chose Golda, and that was Dr. Charles Morgan. Now, if there's anyone in this room who thinks that Charles Morgan doesn't know anything about nodules, I'd like him to get up and say something. Because we tried to pick the best person we could find who is a competent person to support Matthew in this estimate. So we tried to take the best from the different places in the industry. So there were some problems with Charles. He wasn't a member of the appropriate organisation. So we were writing the report and we discovered what the requirements were, and it was quite a panic to get Charles signed up. In the end, he ended up being members of 2 organisations that both qualified, because we didn't know which one would be approved first. In neither case was there any question about his competence. It was simply a case of getting him signed up quickly enough. So the competent person, it's a team, really. There's a lead competent person and a legal organisation that pulls it together. And in this case, Golda were the people to go for because they've experience in meeting the requirements of the code. But I don't think Golda could have done this on their own. Matthew needed the other 2 members of the CP team to get there. We don't like putting in CPs for the sake of it. We could have put 20 guys in there if we wanted to. We kept it as small as we could, and the minimum we needed was 3. We needed Matthew for his experience with the code, for his extensive knowledge on statistics, and the main problems of the nodules we saw were statistical problems, because compared to a lot of other ore bodies, they're flatline and they're fairly easy to get to. We needed Charles Morgan, because he had decades of experience in working in polymetallic nodules. We needed him just as much as we needed Matthew. And we needed Davey Banning, because he had been to site. He had visited our areas for several months of his life, and he had taken lots of samples in those areas, so he could put hand on chest and say, no, I know the nodules are there. There's no chance that this is all being made up. So that's the way we approach this problem. And I agree with what Matthew said before. If you do it properly the first time, you do it once. If you try and do a half-assed job at the beginning, you just have to do it again. Because there's one thing that's important to a mineral resource estimate, and that is that it gives your stakeholders confidence. It's all about giving people confidence that the resource is actually there. It's actually a certain size. It's hard to, overemphasize how important that is. Because I've worked on deposits where suddenly people weren't sure what was there. Or they changed their minds. Or they got worried about things. And that's a terribly destructive thing. And that could do a lot of damage to this growing nodule industry, where suddenly people start to think that, hang on, maybe this nodule resource isn't that big. Maybe they're not really there after all. Maybe it's just something that's not true. So we wanted to, if we're going to be the first, we wanted to do it properly. It's like everything we do, coming back to the original point, with environment, social acceptability, Solwara One project, we realise that if we want to be the first, we have to set a pretty good standard to protect the rest of the industry as well. Thank you.
Just one point, I just want to make sure that people do recognize this. This is about reporting standards. We have mentioned that over and over again here, but it's not about assessing total volume to potential developments of these fields. And Crisco is designed around reporting standards, and UNFC working with it, you do that other piece. So I urge you not to forget that one piece as you focus on Crisco. Crisco may very well be what you need for reporting standards. It is what you need for reporting standards. But I think there is that other piece that you should not lose sight of.
Yeah. I think it is again a quick intervention and all this thing as a response to our friend from Tonga. Actually, in fact, I do recognize, I think the kind of experience they have gained over this, 2 years after their application has been approved by, I think, ISA and all that. I think it looks to be very impressive to me as well. And of course, again here, I think an experience of an individual contractor, it should not get at the end of the day, actually translated into ISA and ISA should not bring as an imposed kind of restriction. See, actually as far as, I think experience of Tonga is concerned, it is all related with the stock market and investors, etc., etc. As we have, and we already have investors who have been into this game as a state-owned entities. So, I think if any of this, recommendations are adopted by ISPA, I think I'm afraid that, it should be clear and, subtle. It should be, clearly defined that it does not become an imposed sort of a restriction on the state entities. State entities have to have its own place in the sense, unlike the stock market investors, and the investors to be, protected at the end of the day. I don't have anything against him and all. I understand actually his anxiety and his investors and his actually capital and all this. But I see the whole thing is that it is identifying a CP, and then CP will act as something. He acts like a judge. He will act as a judge, and the judgment of the CP should not be through the ISA. ISA should not bring it as a regulation. It's fine. It could be a practice for you, and it should not be a practice, global practice. Okay. So I'm sure I'll have the assurance from, I think, from you and all, saying that it will be, at the end of the day, it will be, Crisco will be involved, and Crisco will try to see and bring in a sort of balance in the whole of the situation. I think you have understood. Actually, I'm sure that our anxiety, the anxiety is not an individual. I'm sure that it must be there also in the other hearts and all. It may be that they are not, I think, expressing and all, whereas I'm trying to be actually forthcoming in my expressions and all that, okay? That is having experience in this, I think as an exploration geologist and all, I feel that, we have to be very, very subtle in the whole of this game. And you can't be in a hurry. You can't say somebody has this experience, it should be brought in as an imposed sort of a restriction. Thank you.
I think that's actually a really good segue, perhaps, to our next talk from National Reporting Standards. So maybe I'll pass it over to Paul to give his presentation. Thank you very much, Amanda.